Could you please start by each stating your name and position title and swearing either the oath or the affirmation, starting on my left?
I'm Damian Purins. I'm the Work Health Safety Officer of New South Wales Teachers Federation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
And my name is Michael DeWall. I'm the Senior Vice President of the New South Wales Teachers Federation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would you like to start by making a short opening statement?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear today. Teachers Federation represents over 60,000 members across public education workplaces. For our members, clean indoor air is not a luxury. It is a pedagogical, industrial, accessibility and work health and safety matter. Safe indoor air quality is the essential foundation upon which effective teaching, learning and workplace safety are built. Currently, the majority of classrooms and learning spaces in New South Wales are compromised by a systemic reliance on outdated and often ineffective natural ventilation strategies, effectively just opening doors and windows. In the real world, these strategies are often unworkable due to prevailing weather conditions, the location of many schools near main roads and intersections, poor outdoor air quality, including during bushfire smoke events, or just the background noise created by common school activities such as sport, music lessons, practical PE and lawn mowing and general maintenance. Furthermore, an over-reliance on manual interventions falls short of the standard of risk management required by New South Wales work health and safety laws and codes of practice. It's hard to understand how the Department of Education and TAFE New South Wales can hold that they have genuinely discharged their duty to eliminate or minimise the risks of harm as far as it is reasonably practicable in their current approaches to indoor air quality, where avoiding the cost of engineering control measures seems to be the highest priority. What is clear, however, is the lack of clear air guidelines and enforceable standards in relation to indoor air quality, especially in relation to pollutants and carbon dioxide concentrations, assist the Department, TAFE and other PCBUs to avoid taking urgent action to protect the health and wellbeing of workers. Without constant automated monitoring and clear standards of indoor air quality, it remains a blind spot that is often dismissed as a facilities maintenance issue rather than a core safety control issue. The scientific evidence is abundantly clear. As stated in our submission, Federation accepts the findings and recommendations of the scientists. When we fail to manage the air our children and teachers breathe, we fail them. The science tells us that higher levels of CO2, which accumulates rapidly in crowded, poorly ventilated classrooms, is correlated with impaired cognition, poor concentration and diminished learning outcomes. The science also tells us that CO2 concentrations can act as an effective and easily measurable proxy for indoor pollutants and airborne pathogens. Most people's lived experience tells them that crowded learning spaces are hotbeds for the spread of respiratory illness and that the transmission of pathogens like COVID-19, RSV and influenza. The scientific consensus supports the lived reality of students and teachers. Poor air quality leads to illness, exacerbates asthma and other chronic conditions and leads to higher levels of absence for staff and students. The primary barrier to action is not a lack of science or technology, it's a lack of clear and enforceable standards and a lack of leadership from successive governments and its public education agencies. I also note that we need to acknowledge the context of this discussion. While all levels of government must take responsibility for their actions, there's a massive shortfall in federal government investment in schools infrastructure. The Albanese government restored a public school capital fund for 2023-24, but it was a one-off $215 million investment nationwide. Private schools will receive $2.93 billion in capital funding from Commonwealth Government between 2025 and 2034, according to the Department of Education estimates. There's no allocation for public schools budgeted at this time, and as such, most decisions made around infrastructure are compromised decisions. There's a few things that Federation has recommended that I'll reiterate here. We believe that clear and enforceable standards drive action. This must include enforceable air quality standards in the Work Health and Safety Regulation or in relevant Safe Work New South Wales codes of practice to drive change in this area of air quality. Air quality monitoring in learning spaces should be mandatory. We need routine, transparent monitoring of key indoor air gases and pollutants, particularly CO2 and PM2.5. Clear information allows workers to act to protect their health and safety and to properly identify hazards. Collecting data would allow public education agencies to meet their work health and safety obligations in this area. There must be substantial investment in public education infrastructure. The New South Wales Government must lead and fund the transitions to modern ventilation and air filtration systems that ensure that every worker and every student has access to safe indoor air. The indoor air quality must also be considered an accessibility issue. The medical consensus appears to be that around 50% of the population has some kind of form of chronic illness, and for many of these people, low indoor air quality significantly increases the risk of harm. So the lack of clear guidelines and uncertainty in this area suggests that public education agencies are not meeting their obligations under state and federal disability legislation. And finally, a long-standing issue, all remaining unflued gas heaters must be removed from learning spaces. The most recent public data suggests that over 50% of public school classrooms still have unflued gas heaters. This is startling and indefensible. The Wilcock Institute research that New South Wales Department of Education relies on, and it's publicly available on the website, does not condone the use of these heaters, and in fact it says that safer options should be pursued. Federation believes that an inquiry into cleaner indoor air must consider the harm caused by unflued gas heaters and the relevant pollutants that they release. In closing, just as we do not ask schools to organise their own clear water, we should not expect them to have to manage unsafe air on their own. Federation supports calls from the scientific community and campaigners for the New South Wales Government to demonstrate leadership and to mandate enforceable indoor air quality standards. The New South Wales Work Health and Safety Regulation and the Safe Work New South Wales Codes of Practice provide ready opportunities for immediate change to make clean indoor air a reality in all public education workplaces and classrooms. We welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll start with a couple of my own questions. Earlier on in your statement, you referred to indoor air clean indoor air as a component of a safe workplace, and I'm inclined to agree with you. Obviously, there is already a significant legislative and regulatory framework around workplace health and safety. So what are the particular gaps or barriers at the moment to action being taken under that framework?
Look, I believe it's to do with the enforceable standards. Damian has led our process for our submission and is our Work Health and Safety Officer and may have more detail.
Yeah, look, I think it's the invisibility of the things that may cause harm. So I think there's a ready understanding that breathing will produce CO2. There's a clear recognition, I suppose, that if you have open windows and doors, that maybe the air inside is cleaner. But on what are we basing that judgment? If you're a worker, I've worked in situations where there's been a tyre fire 200 metres from a school, and clearly there's pollutants in the air, and if you open the windows, the ash and stuff's going to come in. But there can be other pollutants in the air that I can't see or smell if I open the windows. There's pollens in the air for some students. It's what are you making the work health and safety judgment on to reduce the hazard if you can't really clearly see the hazard? I did bring with me. I think there's an example to be made that clearly people can identify these hazards. I think and I think in the previous hearing you heard a little bit about, and maybe in some of the submissions about Boston Public Schools. It seems outrageous to me that in 2022 a public school system, could implement in every single classroom that they manage monitoring of CO2, carbon monoxide, PM2.5, PM10, humidity, temperature, and make it publicly accessible for everybody. I can get on there and see stuff. Any parent who's concerned can get on and see things, and workers who might have concerns about their health and safety could look at those hazards and try and do something about it. So right now it's invisible. So I have, I guess, an example here from Boston Public Schools. What I'd like to compare it to is what our Department of Education does. You understand that, I guess, we have sort of two main sets of employers that we work with, the Department and TAFE New South Wales. So it is a question about what they do, I suppose, in our work with our members. Boston Public Schools, transparent, clear. I've downloaded from a table on Friday the several rooms where CO2 was high and where pollution was high, and anyone could have seen that, including the people who are in charge of foreseeable risk in those schools, and they could have taken some action about it. The Department of Education has chosen not to install monitoring, therefore they cannot do the foreseeable risk thing for themselves, which is also their obligation under work health and safety, and the workers too can't do that check for themselves in most rooms in the state. Okay, in the Cleaner Classrooms program, the department has demonstrated they can install these things. They can install ventilation systems that bring in outside air automatically. They can install systems that have CO2 monitoring and warnings and use those to make change. So I guess in answer to your question initially, it's the lack of information that prevents people looking after themselves. So they've got a duty to look after themselves and each other, but if you haven't got the information to hand, then you can't do anything about it. I think we're really strongly arguing that it is really a manageable cost that CO2 monitoring is installed in every classroom in the state, linked up to a public system that everyone can see. Then the department can do its job on foreseeable risk, and workers can do what they need to do to look after themselves in their classrooms and look after their students. Yeah, and community members can see, make their own judgment about whether they think the rooms are clean, and make decisions about the well-being of their children that aren't just based on what they think might be the best practice without information.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I also wanted to ask about the broad range of solutions that are available to improve indoor air quality once it's recognised as poor. And already this morning we've had discussions from things like simple policy changes requiring doors to be open, portable HEPA filters and fans, all the way through to major HVAC upgrades or engineering solutions to the problem. Have you got a view on what sort of solutions that work best in a practical way?
Do you want me to say that this one?
Yeah.
I guess what works best are things that require the least decision making from someone in order for something that's invisible to be looked after. So ventilation that is automatically triggered when CO2 reaches a certain level, for example, in a classroom would be a very helpful thing. That's not to say, though, that there aren't classrooms in the state where where properly operating windows, doors, and cross ventilation in well-designed rooms would not be an appropriate thing to do. The technology isn't just about high-tech things or sealing up classrooms from outside. I catch a train to Central every day, and I'm watching a skyscraper go up that's got opening windows and habitat spaces that's costing billions of dollars. It isn't about sealing everything, but they'll have monitoring. They'll open them when it's appropriate and they'll close it when it's appropriate, because it's business, and business pays to make sure that people are safe. The Department of Education doesn't do that in that sense, in the same way. So, by all means, HEPA filters are available. Victoria, as I'm sure you know, during COVID rolled out 110,000 to their classrooms and installed them pretty much in every classroom and gave instructions about operating them. New South Wales provided the bank in areas where they thought it might be problematic based on an audit of classroom spaces. So increased filtering would be appropriate. Obviously, HEPA filters seem to very much take pathogens out of the air and slow the spread of disease. Properly functioning windows and doors would be useful. But remembering that ventilation can be compromised really easily. There's a code of practice about ventilation comes into the facilities code of practice, but so does thermal comfort. So if you go to the Department of Education website, go to school infrastructure, and it talks about thermal comfort. Thermal comfort's managed, often we're talking about sun coming in, for example, by pulling down blinds and closing windows with film on them. Once you pull down the blind or close the window with film on it, then you no longer have ventilation. So you have this sort of weighing up of thermal comfort. So the best interventions are ones where people don't have to make those compromises, don't have to make decisions about things they can't see, about pollutants or pollens in the air, that actually are engaged based on the best information available. That has to be driven by monitoring of some sort, so that people can make decisions on what is the best thing. Because I think it's very hard to say what the best thing is in a particular context unless you've got the data that you need to make that decision on. That being said, it's clear that the ventilation, like is in this building, it can be installed. The department installs it. They can't argue at all that they haven't got the capacity to install air conditioning systems in schools that bring in outdoor air triggered by CO2 monitoring, because they do. When they do the Cooler Classrooms program, they have that capacity to change the mix of air based on the readings they take and for health. So, hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. And the last one from me before we move on. I was quite alarmed as a former GP about the statistics about unflued gas heaters that remain. And I understand that when the department was asked about that at budget estimates, they were also providing figures for removal of gas heaters. Have you got any information through your members about the process of having those removed? You know, are schools receptive and supported to make that change when it's brought to their attention?
Well, no. That's why they're still there, because no one wants them. No one's arguing in favour of unflued gas heaters. So no, the schools aren't supported to get rid of them. As I understand it, they get replaced if they reach end of life or need repair. So rather than replace them like by like, I think they change them, but that would be a question for the department. The Cooler Classrooms program removes the heaters, so that the rollout, but that's not for every school. And there's clearly nowhere near, as I understand it, we're still not even at half of schools having the heaters removed. Or maybe the other way of looking at it, around half or more than half still have, of classroom spaces, still have those heaters. So the department will often point to the number of schools that have had air conditioning put in, say in library spaces or so forth. That's partly so, as I understand it, for safe spaces in bushfire or something where people can go to and have ventilated rooms that are safer. But the number of schools doesn't reflect the number of classroom spaces. So you might have one big air conditioning unit put into a library, but all the other rooms are still unventilated or require open windows and doors so you can operate the unflued gas heaters. Which it's incredibly unscientific to me. Like there'll be a student sitting near a window a long way away from the heater, and there'll be a student a metre away from the heater. I honestly don't believe unscientifically that the impact's the same for both of those students if you open both windows and doors. And I don't think any real research has been done into it. I just find it amazing that the department relies on the Woolcock Institute report, which is on their website, which doesn't say what they claim it says. It doesn't defend the use of the heaters. All it says is it causes asthma in students that have asthma. It causes increased asthma in those students, and it didn't lead to reduced lung capacity in those students during the course of the research. But it also said in its limitations that they didn't use the heaters very much at this time because it was a warm winter, and in their conclusions they advised that safer means of heating should be found, essentially. So. If that's the best research you've got to defend them, I struggle to understand how we are in a situation in New South Wales where government after government says open the windows and doors in cold places and you'll be fine. It's bizarre to me.
Just also to the matter of willingness and receptiveness, if you like, around the motive to remove these, the history of I guess the will has come from campaigning from parents and teachers in various communities, and that's over many years in different, particularly cold communities. I used to be the organiser for the Blue Mountains, and we had a number of schools up there where the parents worked actively with teachers and various bodies representing asthma to try and get those heaters removed. So it's been a long time coming, and there's still a lot of work to do, clearly.
Thank you. I think that detail is going to be very helpful for when we can hopefully question the Department of Education. I'm happy to go to my colleagues. Mrs. Carter?
Yeah, thank you. I haven't read the Australian Academy of Sciences report that you refer to in your submission. Do they have their own indoor air quality standards that you're supporting? Are they referring to the WELL standards? What are the standards that you think we should be looking to implement?
I didn't bring a copy of their report, but I guess there's a few lines through it that I think are interesting, and I think it's I won't get her title correct, but Professor Morawski seems to be the leading scientist in this area, and I guess what she's arguing for is something that we can clearly accept, that CO2 rises rapidly. She's done her research goes into that area partly. That children breathe quite quickly and increase in a classroom situation. The CO2 levels increase quite rapidly. I think there's general consensus in the community that the level of 800 parts per million is when we start beginning to get concerned, and up around 1,200 parts per million is where cognitive decline and other issues become really evident. So I guess right now, though, that these are just sort of recommendations. There's no standard. There's an acknowledgement, say in the Safe Work New South Wales Code of Practice, that CO2 is problematic, but that's all. It doesn't say, that it should be ideally under 800 parts per million, for example.
So you're only looking at CO2. You're not looking at other particulates or other gases.
Look, I think I would say that in reading the report, that it was clear to me that the science was suggesting that monitoring of those things was appropriate, but I'm not a scientist. I'm an English teacher, they make several recommendations that I think were sound, but as I haven't got the report in front of me, basically what I'm saying is I haven't got a number.
Okay.
I think there's regulation available. I would rely on what the scientists are saying in that area. But I'm very interested in CO2.
Unfortunately, I think what this committee is seeing is that there seem to be different standards which may overlap, but I'm also not a scientist, so I was sort of looking for the guidance that you could give us. There's some very strong statements in your submission in relation to safe work obligations. Has there been a report made to Safe Work about air quality in schools?
It would need to be based on the data which the department seems to be gathering, but they haven't reported it as far as I'm aware.
But there's been no thought that teachers might gather their own data if this is a real concern, and then report to Safe Work so that an investigation is done in that way?
It could be, but what you would be coming up against is what you sort of asked. Your first question was about what would be the hazard, I suppose, if in the absence of an enforceable number or a situation. So, for example, that there are numbers for things like formaldehyde exposure. Yeah. But for the pollutants we're talking about, PM2.5, PM10, carbon dioxide, there isn't a number. I believe that it would not be beyond the Facilities Code of Practice to say that CO2 should be kept below 900 parts per million, for example. That's above what would be generally accepted at 800, but you could draw a line and say once you got to that point that it wasn't acceptable anymore. And if you were clearing that, that's what the other parts of the science say. If you're clearing the air of that CO2 to reduce it, you're also clearing most likely PM2.5, PM10. So increased ventilation improves the quality of air. And I guess from our perspective, and maybe this comes from a perspective of trying to get the most you can out of the budget that you're given, that it would seem to me that CO2 monitoring would provide a proxy for most of the other things. So establishing an appropriate amount of CO2 in a space where people are trying to learn, or in a public building, would be a way of actually taking care of the other things too, without having to establish all the standards that people want to argue about. Because I think we can generally agree that 800 parts per million would be a better level for CO2 than 1,400 parts per million.
So just to track back to the safe work point though,
Yep.
If I understand you correctly, you're saying that your submission is that Department of Education and schools are in breach of their obligations under the Safe Work Act, but there's no reports being made to Safe Work to initiate investigations because there's no number. But then how is it that you're asserting that they're in breach of their obligations to provide a safe place of work?
Okay, so I guess it depends what that would look like. So when I say no reports, we have a recent report of to Safe Work from a TAFE campus in the Wollongong area, where there's a clear ventilation issue. So we're looking at facilities there where the members didn't need to measure the amount of particulate matter in the air, just that there were machines operating and the ventilation wasn't working and there was an exposure. So Safe Work will come in and look at things like that. We haven't got a lot of evidence that Safe Work will come in on and investigate the things like you're asking about. I mean, this isn't my opinion. It's a fact that there are no prosecutions against government agencies in areas like this.
Okay.
There have been none. So even in areas of asbestos where we notice significant problems, we haven't got to prosecution. So I guess in responding to hazards, we have enough trouble trying to get the department to respond to hazards that we can see and are evident, and we have evidence of that's plain, and then get enforcement action from Safe Work through to some sort of prosecution for when things have gone wrong, let alone the ones that are invisible and people can't agree on a standard. So there's a reason why you would pursue certain things and not others. In areas where there's something we can report and think we get action, like at the TAFE I just referred to, where there was an order given by Safe Work because of the ventilation, then we'll take action. But it's hardware, it's an unseen hazard. But to the foreseeable risk piece, which is the department's responsibility, can we foresee that low quality indoor air would cause a hazard to workers and to students? Well, I would say yes, the science already supports that. Has the department collected any data about that? Well, yes, they said in 2021 and 22 they were collecting data about CO2, and they said they'd release it as soon as it was collected and completed. Well, they haven't released that. That's part of the tabling of documents.
So if you're arguing foreseeable risk, are you arguing that the New South Wales Department of Education is negligent?
If they have data that suggests that some of
these...
these...
There's no need for data for negligence. If they have a duty of care, if there's foreseeable risk, if they're not meeting that risk, I mean, the data's irrelevant. So
the primary duty
so
of
you're
care
not
would
looking at
suggest
bringing an action against Department of Education for negligence?
You've asked 3 questions in a row. Can we let the witness actually answer them?
It's one extended question.
Well,
exactly.
Yes, the answer is you're asking a question about something that we didn't really have the power to do until a few months ago with the change of the legislation that the current government's brought in to give greater powers of prosecution.
Sorry, negligence has since 1932 you would have been able to bring that action.
So your word was negligence in that sense. I think that there's
foreseeability of risk is negligence. That's the concept.
Okay, I do take your point. But foreseeable risk requires assessment, identification, assessment, and control measures. It doesn't necessarily. You're suggesting that means negligence. I suggest maybe it could mean negligence.
Okay.
But what I would say is it means you should take action to try and reduce the risk. That's what I'm talking about. If you can foresee a risk, then you're supposed to try and take action to reduce it.
In terms of schools, who's the PCBU?
The PCBU is the Department of Education, and the Secretary of the Department is the PCBU's most senior officer.
And in independent schools and Catholic schools?
You'd have to ask them. It depends on their structure. But in general, though, it would be similar in the sense that a principal doesn't have control in the same way a CEO would have control of something. So in all sectors generally, but that would depend. I would think there'll be some independent schools that would be considered that way, but I don't know the answer to that. But not in public schools.
So last question before I hand over. Just as a practical question, if teachers had CO2 monitors in the classroom and the CO2 monitor registers high, what's the teacher meant to do?
If the windows are closed, they should open them. If ventilation's installed that's not working, this gives the information to take things to Safe Work. Ultimately, if the actions aren't taken, to answer, it goes to your question from before. We can take action when we have clear information and so forth. So something like that would give you a hazard potential to do something about that you can't currently see.
But what's the thing that, like, if the windows are open, like, what's the thing the teachers do? Do they take the kids outside? Like, what's the next step then? If
that system existed and the things are in place that should be in place to have the air clear, then you would need to move to a different space. It may be that the reason it's not clear is because there's something outside that's causing the hazard. So you wouldn't necessarily, I can't say you would move outside, but you would have some information to make a decision about that wasn't just guesswork, I suppose. So if it wasn't about opening the window or checking the ventilation or making sure something's turned on, then yes, you would lose that. You would have the information you need to leave that space with the students and get them out of what may well be a risky
thing. What sort of
thing.
extra training would teachers need to be able to interpret the data and make those decisions appropriately?
Again, I don't. There's a range of things, and the scientists are probably, and the people that build the technology might be better placed to say this. But if you have a look at the Boston Public Schools website, I think anyone can look at the colour coding they use to say low, medium, and high. If you're trained to say high is dangerous, then I think you'd be in a fair space. And I believe some of the systems are a traffic light system. So if it went to a red light, I imagine I've not used a system like this, but a red light would probably mean a risk. You would check the risk. If the windows were closed for some thermal comfort reason, but you needed to flush the air out, you'd open it. If that was what the problem was. If it was something you can't identify, then I guess you'd have some information to say this room might be unsafe to be in and it's time to move.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just add too that the premise of the question underlies part of the problem, which is too often it's when there should be a systemic response and controls in place, we're relying on individual schools to actually take action to get things to happen systemically. So whilst I appreciate the technical sort of conversation around negligence and the work health and safety aspects from the union's point of view, there really should be proactive duty by the department, including providing the data and the systems, so that individual schools have very clear understandings of when things are unsafe and when they're not, and can act upon that, rather than actually having to also kind of lead in quite often a political process where parents and teachers are working together to try and get the system to fulfil its obligations.
Mrs. Bell.
Thanks to you both for hearing today. I wanted to start just with a question around the first recommendation that you referenced in your submission, which is on page 3, that talks about regulated and enforceable indoor air quality standards as outlined by the Australian Academy of Science, and albeit obviously I haven't read their paper either, but it be included in Work Environment and Facilities Code of Practice. I'm just wondering if I can get your thoughts around that and whether that would be a sufficient step in terms of existing, and how that would apply to existing buildings, given, you know, our school infrastructure is what it is. It is of varying ages and stages and sizes and different ventilation systems, if you like. How would you see that as having a positive impact? You said it provides motivation, but yeah.
I'll just start by framing it by sort of saying that, again, in a environment where there isn't adequate commitment to capital expenditure on infrastructure at numerous levels of government, it's a compromised. Your question is basically asking for a compromised answer in terms of, do we just put up with the current infrastructure even if the data tells us that there's problems there, you know? As obviously there would need to be a significant process of capital works to bring about some changes in some contexts.
Yep.
But I think the first thing is getting the information right, getting the standards right, and then having the actual investment to actually bring about that change. None of those things are on the table at the moment.
Okay.
And I think maybe a different way of thinking about what, and I hope it's going to what you're asking, but these things aren't fixed. But once they're established, the standards mean something, and if they're effective, then they stay, or if they're ineffective, they get revised. So things like the like around welding gases, for example, that are, you know, in high school technology, industrial arts spaces, and in TAFEs, advice around that's changed over time. But you've got to start with some form of measurement in the first place in terms of the appropriate safety measures, as well as the types of gases that the people are exposed to. The same for other chemicals and gases. So things like formaldehyde, for example, in the current standards has been changed in terms of level of exposure, and I think maybe the nurses spoke a little bit about that last week. But last in your first hearing. But the absence of the presence of a standard means there's something to be for it to be assessed against, whether it meets or doesn't meet, and sometimes that requires infrastructure. So the welding gases one's a good example, because it meant there was a change in ventilation infrastructure and use of these materials, including in teaching spaces, driven by the exposure limits and the other standards. So I don't think it's beyond the research that's been done to establish what might be safe standards, and then if they're effective, then they'll sit where they are. If they're ineffective, they could be revised to something that's more effective. I think the other one, you know, the idea that these things don't change, I think is sort of a problematic idea. Where we see things like silica exposure, people introduce standards and change work practices and so forth. It doesn't start from an area of knowing what it is and then working backwards. It started from the exposure causing illness, and there was a bit of catch-up being done. I don't think anyone who's learning about this space and the amount of information that's available and the amount of time we spend inside thinks we're in front of the game here. I think we are playing catch-up, And I think establishing some form of standard is an important part of getting enforcement and driving change. I don't think it's just in buildings. Building standards may well be an answer. I'm not an expert in that area, but I tend to think once a building's built, then it's what happens in the building afterwards that's more important. So it's monitoring in an ongoing way. What are we monitoring? Well, I think the scientists have established some things we should be monitoring.
Yeah, look, I think one of the earlier witness this morning, the submission they have provided, Adjunct Professor Jeff Hanmer, talks about Australian Standard 1668.2 throughout the submission as being a good place to start in terms of the National Construction Code. So that may well be, that may well be that place to start, as you've sort of suggested. I'm interested in whether or not your members have told you about any schools or examples where this is done well, or whether you've got any standouts. We had earlier evidence in our first hearing about a school that had initiated the Canaries, the Cleaner Air Initiative,
yes,
or Cleaner Air Network. So whether you can provide the committee with any of that information and some of the improvements that have been seen.
Federation's very supportive of the Cooler Classrooms program, which started under the previous government. As far as I'm not an engineering expert, but the briefs for those systems include bringing in outdoor air and monitoring of the system using CO2 monitors and so forth. I'm not aware of our members often giving us positive stories about things. It's usually when things go wrong that we get engaged. But considering the number of Cooler Classroom schools that have Cooler Classroom initiative, including some very old builds and heritage buildings and so forth, it's clear the department can do this work.
Yeah.
But that was about a temperature measure. It was only about thermal comfort and about heat for the installation. But the fact that there are several hundred of those installations and we don't get complaints about them would suggest that people are happy with them. There's not. I would say to you that the information we've had over time from our state council and so forth is that pretty much all teachers would prefer a modern, clean working space.
Fair enough.
And we're after a statewide rollout of that program, not for individual schools.
Yeah, what we do hear from is schools that wish they were part of that program.
Yes.
Right.
So there's definitely a need for wider investment in that.
If we had that program statewide initially, and that had been concluded, I don't know that we'd have a submission to make of anything like what we've made, because we would have monitoring in the classrooms, we'd have ventilation that could bring in outdoor air, we'd have thermal comfort organised. It is about the fact that the infrastructure is not up to scratch. Overall, as I said, if that program had been rolled out to every school, then we'd be in a different situation. We'd have some faith that the air was cleaner, that was being filtered, and that outdoor air has been brought in a proper ventilated way. But that hasn't happened. So we're not in that space. So we've got the concerns about the spaces that remain, which is most of them.
And just to understand the barriers to achieving that more widely, we have schools that want to be part of that system or have found money to do it themselves, but then they need significant upgrades of their electrical systems because they can't cope with the new technology. So the whole infrastructure question actually is very central to how this can be delivered over time in some settings in particular.
But like I said, there isn't, as far as I'm aware, there aren't buildings they can't do this in. They're doing it in buildings that are over 100 years old and classic Sydney inner city builds, or sort of new builds that weren't built in the early 2000s that didn't have air conditioning installed, or brand new builds will get it as a matter of course. So what's left are all the other schools that don't have this capacity at the moment.
And I presume it's certainly, we were talking earlier today about other measures and whether it would be the responsibility of a teacher if we were to try and monitor air to then put in place controls and things. I presume it's your evidence that teachers don't need another job and another responsibility in terms of everything else they've got to manage with curriculums and students, and that they also shouldn't then be responsible for managing the indoor air quality within a classroom, and then instigating controls if it is the case that it's not up to scratch.
We wouldn't ask other professionals generally to do that.
No. Yeah.
But teachers are asked to do those things. I guess that's our evidence. But I guess it also, even with all those things installed, I would still strongly favour a transparent monitoring system similar to the Boston Public School system, where if there was an issue in a space that I was working in, I could take some action about it to protect myself and the children I was teaching, rather than not know. So even if it was just I wouldn't like the idea of just relying on the mechanical ventilation without a proper monitoring of what was actually happening inside the classroom for pollutants and CO2. Our evidence goes to both those things. Yes, we want better facilities in all spaces, but we also want to be able to monitor it, because you can't take action to protect yourself against indoor air quality issues unless you can actually know what's going on in the air.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you both for being here. A lot of my questions I had already been answered, but I just wanted to get your view. We had an earlier witness who in their written submission, and we didn't actually talk about it this morning, but there was a suggestion for an awareness-raising campaign to teachers, parents and children about the impacts of poor indoor air quality, and looking at things like curriculum-based activities for students, workshops for teachers and engagement sessions for parents. Would you have a view on something like that happening in New South Wales schools?
It seems to me every time something comes up in the wider community, it gets dumped into the school curriculum for schools to take control of and deliver. So obviously, a blunt assessment, that would probably be problematic.
Yeah.
For teachers as workers, I think these things need to be authentically part of their work environment and part of their regular training and support to maintain safe workplaces. The extent to which that should become a curriculum issue is, I think, a highly problematic conversation. But going back to what Damian's already said around even just knowing what's going on inside your classroom in terms of air quality is the first step, and then having some agreed and simple procedures to implement should there be a problem. That seems to me the smart place to start. I wouldn't necessarily be thinking that it would be helpful to expand the curriculum further with other items.
Yeah, no.
Can I suggest as well, though, that there are cohorts in the community that are already well aware of the concerns. As a deputy principal working in high school during the COVID shutdown, reopening and so forth, we know we had students who didn't come back with parents concerned about the health of their children, and many of those concerns remain. So that period of time, I guess, heightened people's awareness of pathogens in the air, and for people with compromised immune systems and respiratory illness and so forth. I think we've still seen the reality that cohort doesn't need education about it. What they actually probably really need is information that says the rooms are safe, and that is,
Well, that goes back to your earlier point about more transparency.
Yeah, if you lived in Boston, you could find out.
Yeah.
But if you live in New South Wales, the department can gather the information, but we can't find out because it's not published. And
I know we're out of time. I just have one more quickly. You mentioned a few TAFE examples before, Mr. Purins, as well. I'm just wondering, in terms of this being an issue that's raised with by your members, in my experience, I think it would be more school teachers than TAFE teachers that raise this for a lot of sort of practical reasons. But would that be a fair assessment as well? This tends to be more of an issue that's impacting classrooms in schools as opposed to TAFE.
Well, I think in the first instance you need to recognise that TAFE is not just a learning environment, but it actually replicates industry. So there would be some very specific industry-specific concerns about air quality in different learning environments across TAFE.
Yeah.
And look, the concerns are shared. So when our TAFE council will talk about similar concerns maybe actions taken in different ways, and are dealing with a different community, I suppose, in terms of instead of working in your local community as a primary school teacher, it's a little bit different as a TAFE teacher, I suppose. So the expression of the concern is different, but the reality of many of the buildings and the campuses is much the same. So a teacher teaching adults English in a classroom situation will face similar issues. But I guess there is that difference, and often that will be sometimes quite a bit smaller cohort, and adults breathe more slowly than children, and you fit 30 kids in a room that's smaller, and they breathe more quickly, then you increase the CO2 much more quickly. And I don't know, that sort of lived experience piece that Michael mentioned in his opening. My lived experience of my kids in preschool, or care, primary school, high school, is that you put kids together that are sick, then everyone gets sick.
Yeah. I think that's universally acknowledged.
Yeah, and those sorts of things. The phrase foreseeable risk came up before. I think that's foreseeable risk. If we know that those things cause harm, and we know that cleaning the air can improve that situation, I don't think it should be about individual cases. That's a shared system responsibility that I think we can do something about for everybody. It benefits everyone, public spaces, preschools, primary schools, high schools, TAFEs. If people have clean air in those spaces, I don't see what the downside is, and we can do better at measuring and doing something about it.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Sorry, I went a bit over time.
That's all right. That was a beautiful note to end on. Thank you again for the time you've taken and for your evidence. If there are supplementary questions, the Secretary will be in touch about those. And we'll now break for lunch, and we'll be back at 1:45.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for inviting us.
Thank you.
I did have some stuff that I was happy to table. Do you want me just to leave it here? And
Please,
I didn't really refer to it in that.
Sure, can I email it?
So I don't
Oh,
think
you can say I wrote
I might
something
even.
in.
We transcribed the audio. It's just
The witness at 1:45 would have to leave after 15 minutes, and I think that looks more rude.
Yeah, I'll just quickly touch it up when I get back to the office and email it to you.